Okay, this is a question from Matt on Facebook. I live in Northern Ireland. Can you tell me what this deal means for me and how it will be different for England, Scotland and Wales?
Okay, the Irish aspect of this is anyone who's even passingly been interested in this is a huge part of the discussion. It's one of the reasons why the negotiations have been so difficult and fraught. If the UK and the EU are able to find a future deal by the end of the transition period, then Matt will not see any difference between himself and other people in Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. The only thing that is different is if at the end of the transition period there isn't that agreement in place, in which case we've had this whole argument, has been an argument, about a backstop arrangement. So the Irish government, and by extension the EU, has been concerned that leaving the EU means that all the arrangements for cross-border activity and generally for the governance of the island of Ireland will fall because actually the assumption of the Good Friday Agreement was that both the UK and Ireland were EU member states. And there's a commitment in the Good Friday Agreement to not change the arrangements without the consent of the parties. So the EU negotiators have insisted, partly because the British government seems to be so uncertain in what it wants and what it's trying to do. It says we need a cast iron guarantee that we can protect the border arrangements as they are, even if we can't agree something for the whole of the UK. So that's really where this backstop arrangement comes. So partly it's about customs, but it's also about keeping standards and regulations aligned in a whole range of areas, which might imply the need for border checks.
Okay.
I know we talk a lot about, I do have to talk about customs a lot, but you hear politicians talking a lot about customs arrangements. Customs is a teeny tiny part of why you have checks at borders. You have checks at borders because of health and safety. Food safety is a really big thing, particularly in Ireland, because you've got a lot of movement back and forth across the border for various reasons. Just standards, environmental standards, all of those things matter. So the EU has said we need to keep this thing in our back pocket should we not be able to agree a new treaty. The UK didn't like that because it would then create differences between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. We know that the DUP was not accepting of that. So we've now got this kind of compromise position where in the first instance what would happen without a deal is that you'd get a UK-wide customs arrangement. So basically you'd sort of be carrying on some of the customs practices that are here at the moment, maybe under a different title so that it's not actually being a member of the customs union. I think that's a technicality. But also again with that alignment of regulations to make sure that you don't have a need for barriers. That's still really contentious. It's one of the things that a lot of MPs are not happy about, because the only way you can stop this is by both parties agreeing that you don't need it anymore. So the UK has a veto, but the EU has a veto, and you would imagine that the EU is not going to ever be in a position where it says, fine, let's have a border. Certainly not in the current state of things. But that's all really, it's fallback positions. And again, I think it's really a function of how difficult the negotiations have been, how at times bad-tempered the negotiations have been, that they don't want to have, the EU say they don't want to have the backstop arrangements, the Irish say the same, the UK certainly says the same. So all of this is just in case. So really the question, I think, is how likely is it that we have to use any of this? And there I think we've got some uncertainty, because that period of transition where things stay the same but not being members doesn't really look long enough to be able to get the comprehensive deal that you would need to avoid having that backstop arrangement come into effect. So there's some wording about extending that period of transition to allow for more time. There are different ways you could go around negotiating the future treaties, but at the moment you won't see anything happening. Assuming this comes into effect, you won't see any difference between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, certainly until the end of transition. If you don't have a deal, and we leave without a deal, then you will instantaneously see effects on the Irish border, because that will be the only land border that's there. You won't have differences between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, but you'll have lots of other kinds of effects. So, that's the kind of the counterfactual.
So it sounds like there are a couple of ways it could work. One that kind of standards stay the same across the board, one that with no deal that it would have to be different, but actually ultimately it will depend on how long the transition period is to kind of arrange.
Yeah, and again, it slightly depends on what kind of deal there is.
Yeah.
So again, borders are not just about customs, they are about different things. So you might be able to avoid some elements of checks. Some checks you don't have to do at a border, you can do behind the border. So there are a lot of people who are spending a lot of time trying to unpack this and unpick this. But it is very much a work in progress, and I think the underlying problem still, to come back to the kind of the recurring theme, is that the UK hasn't been clear about what it wants. Let's say we had a change of government and they said they wanted to be part of the single market, part of the customs union, then that would be relatively simple to arrange, because that's more or less continuing what goes on, and then you wouldn't need the backstop arrangement in place. So again, moving parts, lots of moving parts.
Lots of moving parts.
So yeah, at the moment, the intention of all parties is that Northern Ireland never gets treated differently from the rest of the UK. But within that sentence are hidden multitudes.
Okay.